Spring, 1943. Something strange began haunting the skies over occupied Europe. German pilots reported the same terrifying sign. A brief, piercing sound, like a blade cutting through the wind, and then silence.
No hecho. No trace.
Only wreckage falling from the clouds. The generals called it an illusion. The pilots called it a curse. But it was real. A fighter so fast it seemed to defy time itself. Radar couldn't catch it. Bullets couldn't touch it. Came out of nowhere, and vanished just as fast. Behind that ghost in the sky was a man almost lost to history. An engineer. An immigrant who had fled Germany long before the war. Carrying nothing but a notebook, a broken heart, and a dream no one believed could fly. While the world burned, he worked in silence. Sketch by sketch, line by line, he shaped a machine that would rewrite the limits of flight. Each design was a memory, each calculation a promise that freedom could have wings. The result? A fighter so advanced the Nazis couldn't even understand it, let alone catch it. But the true power of that aircraft wasn't in its speed. It was in the mind that built it. A man driven not by glory, but by redemption. Between that sharp sound and the silence that followed, a legend was born. A legend still echoing in the clouds. Unseen, untouchable, alive every time the wind cuts across the sky. Spring, 1943. The war had already carved deep scars across Europe's face, turning cities into graveyards and skies into battlefields. But something new was about to shift the balance, something nobody saw coming. German pilots, men who'd flown thousands of hours and survived dogfights that would have broken lesser souls, started reporting encounters that didn't make sense. They'd see a glint on the horizon, hear a sharp whistle cutting through the clouds, and then nothing, just silence and wreckage. At first, the Luftwaffe brass dismissed these reports as combat fatigue or overactive imaginations. After all, how could a fighter plane simply appear out of nowhere, strike with surgical precision, and vanish before anyone could even get a clean shot? The Nazi high command had built their entire air superiority doctrine on the belief that German engineering was untouchable, that their Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters were the apex of aviation technology. They'd conquered Poland, France, and half of Russia with that confidence. But now, Allied bombers were making it deeper into German territory, and coming back home alive. The whispers started in officer clubs, between shots of schnapps and nervous laughter. Pilots who'd faced the Spitfire and the Thunderbolt knew what those planes could do. They were formidable, sure, but predictable. You could outmaneuver them, outlast them, outsmart them if you knew the game. But this new fighter? It was different. It didn't just fly, it hunted. It stalked bomber formations like a predator studying its prey, then struck with a speed that seemed to mock the laws of physics. The fastest fighter anyone had ever seen. One veteran Luftwaffe ace, a man with 23 kills painted on his fuselage, described it like this: "It's like chasing a ghost that can kill you." He'd been escorting a bomber formation near the French coast when he saw it. A sleek, silver shape that seemed to materialize out of the sun itself. He pushed his throttle forward, felt his FW-190 strain under the acceleration, but the enemy fighter just pulled away, effortlessly, as if it was toying with him, as if his years of training, his decorated service, his entire understanding of aerial combat meant absolutely nothing against whatever the hell that thing was. The reports kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. Near Schweinfurt, 3 Bf-109s engaged what they thought was a lone American escort, only to have it destroy 2 of them in less than 30 seconds and chase the third for miles before breaking off, almost casually. Over the Ruhr Valley, an entire squadron claimed they'd been attacked by a fighter that seemed to accelerate while climbing, something that shouldn't have been aerodynamically possible with World War II technology. The Nazi propaganda machine tried to spin these stories, calling them exaggerations or Allied disinformation. But the pilots knew better. They'd seen it with their own eyes. What the Germans didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly known, was that behind this untold story of aerial dominance was a single mind. Not a committee of engineers or a team of designers, but one man who'd walked away from everything to chase an impossible dream. A genius engineer who'd once called Germany home, who'd fled the very regime now scrambling to understand his creation. His name was Edgar Schmud, and he'd left the fatherland years before the war with nothing but a worn notebook and a vision that his former countrymen had laughed at, dismissed, ignored. But America hadn't ignored him. In the vast expanse of freedom that Nazi Germany could never comprehend, Schmud had found something more powerful than intimidation or fear. He'd found possibility. And from that possibility, he'd shaped a weapon so revolutionary that it would rewrite the entire narrative of the war in the air. The P-51 Mustang wasn't just another fighter plane. It was the physical manifestation of what happens when genius meets opportunity, when innovation isn't strangled by ideology. The Nazis couldn't catch it because they'd never understood what created it. A mind freed from the chains they'd tried to forge around an entire generation. And now, that mind was hunting them across every sky they once claimed as their own. Edgar Schmud wasn't supposed to escape. In the Germany of the early 1930s, talented engineers were considered national assets, especially ones who understood the dark poetry of aerodynamics the way Schmud did. He'd grown up in Bavaria, surrounded by the Alps, watching birds cut through mountain winds with an efficiency that seemed almost mathematical. While other kids played soldiers, young Edgar was sketching wing profiles in the margins of his schoolbooks, calculating lift-to-drag ratios before he even knew the proper terminology. Aviation wasn't just his passion. It was the language his soul spoke. But Germany in those years was changing, and not in ways that nurtured dreamers. The rise of the Nazi regime brought with it a suffocating ideology that demanded conformity, that saw engineering as a tool for domination rather than exploration. Schmud watched as colleagues who questioned orders disappeared, as Jewish scientists were purged from universities, as the entire culture of innovation became twisted into something ugly and brutal. He'd seen what happened to people who didn't fit the mold, who carried the wrong last name or held the wrong beliefs. The message was clear. Genius was welcome only if it served the Reich. So Schmud made a choice that would have terrified most men in his position. In 1930, years before the world truly understood what Nazi Germany would become, he packed a single suitcase. Inside it, he placed some clothes, a few photographs, and a leather-bound notebook filled with aircraft designs that represented years of obsessive work. These weren't just sketches. They were blueprints for a fighter plane that existed nowhere except in his mind. A machine that would combine range, speed, and agility in ways that conventional wisdom said was impossible. His colleagues had mocked these designs, called them fantasy, the work of someone who didn't understand practical limitations. The journey to America wasn't romantic or heroic. It was terrifying. Schmud traveled with forged papers, moving through checkpoints where one wrong answer could mean imprisonment or worse. He crossed borders in the dead of night, slept in train stations, ate when he could afford to. Every mile away from Germany felt like peeling off a layer of suffocation, but also like abandoning something he'd once loved. This was the land of Beethoven and Goethe, of precision craftsmanship and philosophical depth. But it had also become the land of book burnings and broken windows, where brilliance was measured by racial purity rather than actual merit. When Schmud finally arrived in the United States in 1931, he had $27 in his pocket and spoke English with an accent so thick people often asked him to repeat himself 3 times. He found work where he could, drafting, translating technical documents, anything to survive while he searched for someone who might understand his vision. America in the Great Depression wasn't exactly rolling out red carpets for immigrant engineers with radical ideas about fighter plane design. But there was something different here, something he'd never experienced in Germany. Nobody told him what he couldn't dream about. Nobody demanded he abandon his notebook full of impossible designs. The breakthrough came when he landed a position with North American Aviation in California. It wasn't glamorous at first, just another engineering job at a company trying to survive in a competitive market. But Schmud recognized something the moment he walked through those factory doors. Freedom. Not the abstract concept politicians talked about, but the tangible, practical freedom to fail, to experiment, to challenge conventional thinking without fearing midnight arrests. His supervisors noticed immediately that this quiet German refugee saw aircraft designed differently than anyone else. Where others saw limitations, Schmud saw problems waiting for elegant solutions. What the Nazi regime had lost, what they'd actively driven away, was now working in a sun-drenched California hangar, sketching designs that would eventually haunt German skies. Schmud didn't work out of hatred for his homeland. He worked because he finally could. Because in America, a genius engineer didn't need the right pedigree or party membership. He just needed to be brilliant. And Schmud was about to prove just how brilliant a freed mind could be. The designs in that worn leather notebook, the ones his former colleagues had dismissed as fantasy, were about to become the Luftwaffe's worst nightmare. The man who escaped hell was preparing to send a gift back to the regime that had rejected him. A fighter plane they couldn't catch, built by a mind they tried to cage. By 1940, the world was burning, and America knew it couldn't stay on the sidelines much longer. The British were desperate. Their Spitfires were magnificent defenders, but they couldn't escort bombers deep into enemy territory and make it back home. The problem wasn't courage or skill. It was simple, brutal mathematics. Range versus fuel versus weight. Every aviation engineer in the world understood this iron triangle, and most had accepted it as an unsolvable problem. Most engineers, but not Edgar Schmud. He looked at that same equation and saw something nobody else did. An assumption waiting to be shattered. North American aviation got the call that would change everything. The British needed fighters, thousands of them, and they needed them fast. The company's executives knew they couldn't just copy existing designs. The P-40s and P-39s were decent, but they weren't going to win the war in the air. What the Allies needed was something revolutionary, a fighter that could fly from England to Berlin and back without stopping to refuel. In most engineering departments, this request would have been met with polite laughter and a lecture on thermodynamics. But Schmud had spent a decade waiting for exactly this moment. That leather notebook, carried from Germany, was about to justify every mile of his escape. The design phase was chaos orchestrated by genius. Schmud worked 18-hour days, surrounded by blueprints and calculations that covered every surface of his office. He wasn't just designing an aircraft, he was reimagining what an aircraft could be. The key innovation, the laminar flow wing, a design so aerodynamically clean it seemed to slip through air rather than fight against it. Most wings of that era were shaped by tradition and incremental improvements. Schmud threw out tradition entirely. He calculated airflow patterns with a precision that bordered on obsession, shaping every curve and angle to minimize drag while maximizing lift. It was aviation poetry written in mathematics. But the wing was just the beginning of this untold story of innovation. Schmud convinced his team to mount the engine in a way that had never been done before, positioning the radiator beneath the fuselage to actually create additional thrust from the cooling air, turning a necessary component into an advantage. He obsessed over weight distribution, removing every unnecessary ounce while maintaining structural integrity. The fuselage was sleek, almost sculptural, like something that had evolved naturally rather than been designed in a factory. When colleagues questioned his choices, Schmud would pull out his calculations, demonstrate the math, and quietly prove them wrong. Every single time. The prototype rolled out in October 1940, just 102 days after the initial drawings were approved. 102 days. Most aircraft development programs took years. Schmud and his team had created a functional fighter in less than 4 months. When test pilot Vance Breeze took it up for the first flight, he came back down shaking his head in disbelief. The plane didn't just fly well, it flew like it was from another era entirely. It handled like a sports car, accelerated like it weighed half what it actually did, and felt stable at speeds that should have torn lesser aircraft apart. Breeze's official report used words like exceptional and unprecedented. His unofficial comments to fellow pilots were simpler. Boys, this thing is magic. But magic needs the right fuel to work properly, and the early Mustangs, powered by Allison engines, were good but not great. They dominated at low altitudes but struggled above 15,000 feet, exactly where bomber escorts needed to operate during World War II. For months, it looked like Schmud's masterpiece might become just another footnote in aviation history, another almost story. Then someone had the idea that would complete the transformation. Marry Schmud's airframe to the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. It was like giving wings to a hurricane. The P-51 Mustang, in its final form, could fly higher, faster, and farther than any fighter in existence. Allied air superiority was no longer a dream, it was an engineering certainty. By 1943, Mustangs were rolling off production lines by the thousands, each one a testament to what happens when genius meets necessity. Schmud would walk through the factory floor, watching workers rivet together aircraft based on his designs, and feel something he hadn't felt since leaving Germany. Vindication. Not the bitter kind, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing he'd been right all along. Those impossible designs in his notebook, the ones his colleagues had mocked, were now the most feared fighter planes in the European theater. The genius engineer who'd escaped with nothing but dreams and determination had built a weapon that would help break the Nazi war machine. And the sweetest irony? The fighter that the Nazis couldn't catch was designed by a man they'd driven away, shaped by a mind they tried to silence, powered by the very freedom they despised. The first time a full squadron of P-51 Mustangs escorted bombers all the way to Berlin and back, something fundamental shifted in the war. It was March 1944, and the Luftwaffe had grown accustomed to a certain rhythm. Allied bombers would penetrate German airspace, their escorts would eventually turn back due to fuel limitations, and then the real slaughter would begin. German fighters had turned this predictable pattern into an art form, waiting like wolves for the moment when the sheep lost their protectors. But on that crisp morning, the escorts didn't turn back. They kept coming, and the wolves suddenly found themselves being hunted. Luftwaffe pilots who'd survived years of combat described the experience as surreal, almost dreamlike in its horror. They'd climbed to intercept bomber formations, expecting the usual engagement patterns, and instead found themselves facing fighters that seemed to operate by different physical laws. The Mustang didn't just outrun German aircraft, it outlasted them, outmaneuvered them, and did it all while flying hundreds of miles deeper into enemy territory than should have been possible. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 pilot could push his aircraft to its absolute limits and watch a P-51 casually pull away while climbing. It wasn't a fair fight. It was a demonstration of how thoroughly one side had been outthought. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Before the Mustang entered widespread service, Allied bomber losses on deep penetration raids sometimes exceeded 20%. Unsustainable casualties that nearly broke the strategic bombing campaign. After Edgar Schmud's creation took over escort duties, those loss rates dropped to single digits. Bomber crews who'd been writing goodbye letters before every mission started believing they might actually survive the war. The psychological impact was as important as the tactical one. When you know you've got the fastest fighter in the sky watching your back, you fly differently. You fight differently. But it wasn't just about the raw performance numbers or the aviation history being rewritten with each mission. The Mustang fundamentally changed how air warfare worked in World War II. German factories couldn't hide anymore. Oil refineries deep in occupied territory became viable targets. The Nazi war machine depended on resources flowing from conquered territories, and suddenly every supply line was vulnerable. Schmud's fighter plane had range that turned the entire European theater into a hunting ground. Luftwaffe commanders found themselves fighting a defensive war they couldn't win, watching their most experienced pilots get picked off by an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. There's a combat report from April 1944 that captures the shift perfectly. A group of FW-190s attempted to intercept B-17 bombers near Munich. Standard tactics, aggressive approach, numerical advantage. They never reached the bombers. A squadron of Mustangs hit them from above and behind, using speed and altitude to dictate every term of the engagement. In less than 4 minutes, 7 German fighters were destroyed, 2 more severely damaged, and the rest scattered in full retreat. 0 American losses. The group commander's report noted, almost casually, that the enemy appeared unable to counter our energy advantage. That's military speak for, they couldn't touch us. The fighter that Nazis couldn't catch had become their nightmare made real. Stories spread through Allied squadrons about what the Mustang could do in the hands of a skilled pilot. There was the time a single P-51 chased a German jet, the revolutionary Me-262, and forced it to land rather than engage. Or the mission where Mustangs strafed German airfields so deep in occupied territory that Nazi commanders initially thought the reports were Allied propaganda, because no fighter should have been able to reach those locations and return home. Every impossible mission completed, every bomber formation brought back intact, every German ace shot down. They were all tributes to the military innovation of one quiet engineer who'd fled oppression to build freedom with aluminum and inspiration. The strategic impact rippled far beyond individual dogfights. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively lost air superiority over its own territory. German pilots who'd once terrorized Europe now flew with the desperate energy of men who knew they were outmatched. Training programs couldn't replace experienced pilots fast enough. Fuel shortages meant even their best aircraft sat grounded. And hovering above it all, like silver ghosts in the high-altitude sun, were squadrons of Mustangs. The true war story of how a German refugee's genius had come back to haunt the regime that rejected him. The skies over Europe hadn't just changed hands. They'd been conquered by a mind that refused to be caged, shaped into a weapon by a nation that understood the power of letting genius be free. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world celebrated its heroes with parades and medals and monuments. Fighter aces became household names. Their kill counts turned into legends told in bars and books. Generals wrote memoirs. Bomber crews received ticker-tape welcomes. But Edgar Schmid? He went back to his drafting table, back to the quiet work of shaping metal and mathematics into flight. There were no parades for engineers, no monuments to the minds that had actually won the war. The genius engineer who'd built the fighter that changed everything simply returned to doing what he'd always done, dreaming of better ways to conquer the sky. North American aviation kept him on, of course. They weren't stupid enough to let that kind of talent walk away. Schmid continued designing aircraft through the late 1940s and into the jet age, applying the same innovative thinking that had birthed the Mustang to new challenges. He worked on the F-86 Sabre, the jet fighter that would dominate the skies over Korea just a few years later. Same philosophy, same obsessive attention to aerodynamic efficiency, same willingness to challenge every assumption. But the public never learned his name. Aviation history books mention the P-51 Mustang in reverent tones while relegating Schmid to footnotes, if they mentioned him at all. It was as if the aircraft had designed itself. This erasure wasn't malicious, it was simply how the world worked. People connect with stories of individual heroism, of men in cockpits facing death with courage. That's compelling. That's cinematic. But a quiet immigrant spending 18-hour days calculating laminar flow equations? That doesn't make for exciting dinner conversation. Schmid understood this, or at least accepted it. He'd never chased fame anyway. He'd chased perfection in design, the satisfaction of solving problems that others considered unsolvable. The untold story of his genius didn't bother him the way it might have bothered lesser men. He had his notebooks, his calculations, his legacy written in the sky every time a Mustang took flight. By the time Schmid retired in the 1950s, the world had moved on. The P-51 Mustang was being phased out, replaced by jets that flew faster and higher. The World War II technology that had seemed so revolutionary was now considered almost quaint. Younger engineers looked at Schmid's propeller-driven masterpiece the way you might look at a horse-drawn carriage, historically interesting but ultimately obsolete. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't see, was that every jet fighter they were designing carried Schmid's DNA. The principles he'd pioneered, minimize drag, maximize efficiency, make every component serve multiple purposes, those weren't outdated. They were fundamental, eternal. Schmid spent his final years in California, in a modest house with a workshop where he still sketched designs for aircraft that would never be built. Neighbors knew him as that friendly old German guy who'd worked in aviation, but they had no idea they were living next to someone who'd altered the course of World War II. He'd attend air shows occasionally, watching modern jets scream overhead, and you could see the calculations running behind his eyes, analyzing, critiquing, appreciating. He never bragged about the Mustang. When people asked what he'd done during the war, he'd say something simple like, "I worked on fighters," and change the subject. The war documentary films never interviewed him. The historians never knocked on his door. He died in 1985, at the age of 85, having lived long enough to see his P-51 Mustang become a beloved icon of aviation museums and airshows. The aircraft had achieved a kind of immortality. Beautifully restored examples still flew. Their distinctive sound still made crowds look skyward. Collectors paid fortunes to own them. But even as thousands attended airshows to watch Mustangs perform, how many knew the name Edgar Schmid? How many understood that the fighter plane they were cheering for was the physical manifestation of one man's refusal to let oppression kill his dreams? The genius who'd escaped Nazi Germany had given the world wings, and the world had barely noticed he existed. Yet here's the thing about true innovation: it doesn't need recognition to be real. Every modern fighter jet, every commercial aircraft, every machine that slips efficiently through the sky carries forward principles that Schmid helped establish. The laminar flow wings, the integrated cooling systems, the philosophy that great aircraft design is about solving impossible problems with elegant simplicity. Air forces around the world still study the Mustang, still marvel at how a World War II fighter designed in 102 days could be so thoroughly, perfectly right. Schmid's legacy isn't in history books or monuments. It's in the sky itself, in every aircraft that flies with that same combination of power and grace. The forgotten genius gave wings to freedom, and those wings are still flying, carrying forward a vision born in a refugee's notebook, refined in a California hangar, and proven in the skies over a burning continent. The man may have faded into obscurity, but the mind that built the impossible, that's still soaring, untouchable, eternal as the wind itself. So there it is, the untold story of a man who turned rejection into revolution, who escaped oppression and answered it with genius. Edgar Schmid didn't build the P-51 Mustang for glory or recognition. He built it because he could, because America gave him the freedom that Nazi Germany had denied, because innovation flourishes where minds aren't chained by ideology. That's the real lesson here. The fastest fighter in World War II wasn't just a triumph of engineering. It was proof that when you let brilliant people dream without fear, they'll reshape the world. Think about it. Right now, somewhere in the world, there's probably another Edgar Schmid. Someone with a vision nobody believes in. Someone carrying a notebook full of impossible ideas. What happens to that person depends entirely on whether they find the freedom to create or face the walls that crush potential before it can bloom. The fighter that Nazis couldn't catch exists because one man refused to let hatred kill his dreams. What are you refusing to let die? What impossible thing are you carrying that the world needs to see? If this true war story moved you, hit that like button. It genuinely helps us bring more forgotten histories to light. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss these stories that deserve to be told. Drop a comment below and let me know. Where in the world are you watching this from? I'm curious to see how far these wings of history can fly. And hey, don't stop here. Click on that video up above in the card. Trust me, you'll want to see what we've got lined up next. Keep learning, keep questioning, and remember, the greatest innovations often come from the minds that refuse to be silenced.